Brilliant. So this evening we are doing a bit of Zohar. We're going to be learning a bit of Zohar. I know some of you have learned Zohar with me before. Quick show of hands, who's read the Zohar at all in any way, in any fashion, previously in their lifetime? Yeah, okay, cool. A little bit of this. Okay, so just going to do a little brief introduction to what the Zohar is, and then I actually just want to dive into it, read, and discuss. And I do want us to discuss. I know it's not easy via Zoom, but it's not that big of a group. We can easily discuss a little bit as well, because no one wants to hear me talk the whole time. So the Zohar is a book, but it is a very, very, very big and complicated book. It's really not a book in that no one sat down to write it as a book. It's an anthology of texts. Most of them are medieval. Some of them are late antique. Some of them are ancient, probably, but there's no real way to tell, although many scholars try very frequently to tell what the different levels are and what the significance is to all of them. By and large, we just have to accept that it's an anthology of a variety of texts, which probably were composed and written over the period of time from 2nd century, right, the early rabbinic period, the time of Chazal, up until the 13th century when it comes to light. It is published, although published is not really the accurate term, in 1275 for the first time. And what we mean by published is that someone finally wrote it down and put it in a manuscript and other people saw it. So there's, welcome Lee. So there's a great deal of confusion around the textual history of the Zohar, which we could spend hours and hours on, which we're not interested in doing per se. But what I'm more interested in talking about is what it is as a book and what its significance is. So as a collection of texts, which for this purpose in shorthand we'll call a book, the Zohar is trying to do several things at once. One of the things, and the predominant thing, is that it's trying to be a midrash. Right? A midrash is any genre of rabbis commenting on interpreting the Torah, explaining things that don't make sense. Why did it happen this way? Why does this verse say this and that? That's a midrash. And so it's taking a biblical text and trying to explain why the text says the things it says. What does it mean? That's one of the levels that's happening. In addition, it's also a narrative, a story, a lot like the Canterbury Tales. If anyone had to read that in school, I'm really sorry. It's this kind of medieval, rolling, roving story in which you have a couple characters who we come to meet and who have their own adventures and meet different people, but actually the main focus is what they learn when they talk to those people or what the dialogue is between characters. It's not really a novel in any significant way, but there is a fictional element to it in that there's a framing of different characters and the adventures they have. In addition, and probably the most important level, is that in those dialogues and in those interpretations and in those stories, what the rabbis who serve as the characters are doing is actually introducing a novel and yet very traditional interpretation to Judaism as a whole. Not just one text of the Torah, not just one aspect, but actually Judaism as a whole. And the way that they're doing that is through a theology, which is not explicit prior in Jewish sources, but they believe is implicit prior in Jewish sources. That theology is very heavily involved with mythology, meaning that they're going to talk about God in ways that seem to us explicitly polytheistic, right? The big no-no of Judaism, of course, talking about God as anything other than singular. The Zohar has no problem with. Going to talk about God as male and female, as old and young, as a warrior, as this, as that. And they're playing with that as a series of symbols as a way to try and get closer to some theological understanding of what God is. So there's a certain kind of radicalness to it that might be surprising. And yet, every time they teach something, chances are they're basing it off of somewhere in what we call Chazal, meaning rabbinic literature, meaning the sages. So usually, even the craziest teachings that we find in the Zohar, there's probably a basis in that in one of the Midrashim, or in one of the texts that we find in the Talmud. There's some strange stories in the Talmud, which you may or may not be aware of. They always do have a source. They're not making anything up, but they are, in fact, developing the sources they have into something that is quite radical and quite unique. And that's this mystical theology in which God is made up of many pieces which interact with each other. The two predominant pieces that they understand it to be is a kind of male energy and a female energy. And the result of that is that the Zohar is very obsessed with understanding the relationship between the male energy of God and the female energy of God. In practice, when you read it, it doesn't sound like they're talking about one deity. It sounds like they're talking about two, a male one and a female one. But in theory, what they mean is that God manifests sometimes male, sometimes female, which is very interesting for our contemporary world in which we talk a lot about gender and the gender binary. In some way, the Zohar is talking about that as well, but in a divine sense. On top of all of that, I know there's a lot. On top of all of that, it's also a medieval text, a very medieval text written by Jews, educated rabbis in medieval Spain, in the predominantly the 13th century. And as a result, it has a lot of influence from chivalry, from medieval culture of knights serving noble ladies, and the structures of society at the time in Christian Europe, which predominantly was written in the Christian part of Spain, certainly influenced the theology and the storytelling of the Zohar itself. Now, its influence is huge. Even if you've never read it before, you do things differently as a Jew because of the Zohar, and you might not realize that. Certain things like Kabbalat Shabbat, the ritual of welcoming Shabbat, the songs we sing, right? Lecha Dodi is not just a nice poem. It's actually singing to a feminine conception of God, the bride who's coming to join us for the wedding ceremony. All that symbolism is not accidental. It comes from the Zohar. The whole institution of Kabbalat Shabbat comes from the Zohar. Much of how we observe Judaism today comes from the Zohar. Tu B'Shvat, which is coming up this week, Wednesday night, Thursday, is something that comes heavily from the Zohar. Now, I don't mean the Zohar makes up Tu B'Shvat. It exists in the Mishnah 1,000 years earlier, but it becomes very important to the Zohar in a way it wasn't important before. And that's what the Zohar is doing. It's actually emphasizing things in Judaism which were ignored previously. And as a result, it's actually quite a conservative text, meaning it's trying to revive things that were missing before. It's actually masorti, right? It's traditional in some way. But at the same time, what it's teaching us is absolutely wacky and bonkers. So what we're going to look at today is a passage from the Zohar's commentary on Bishalach. Bishalach is the Torah portion in which the Israelites leave Egypt, which is the one we're going to be reading this Shabbat, which is why I chose it for today. It contains the Song of the Sea, right, that the Israelites sing. And the Haftarah for Bishalach, for anyone who knows, is from the book of Judges and tells of Deborah, the prophetess and female warrior. And just keep that in mind, because that's what the Zohar is working with. What the Zohar is going to do is take a bunch of texts, a bunch of biblical texts, try and give them interpretations, string them together, play with them in funny ways, which means we need to think about, as readers, both what the normal reading is, so we understand what the Zohar is doing differently, and also try and grasp what they're trying to teach us. And they're not always explicit about it. Remember, this is quite esoteric things. They're not going to come out and say, this is what we're saying. It requires some discussion and interpretation, which is what hopefully we'll get a chance to do together this evening. Any questions about any of that? I realize it's a very brief and not altogether thorough introduction. Oh, I forgot something. Yes, Amir.
Just a quick one, which is that I believe, if I remember correctly, asking a rabbi when I was in high school, I think, that I was interested, and he kind of shunned it off by saying you're not old enough, and then also saying that you're only supposed to study, Kabbalah and read the Zohar between like midnight and 2 a.m., which did not fit with my bedtime, as my dad can probably attest.
Yes, very good. So yes, because the ideas of the Zohar they can be quite destabilizing to people who aren't as familiar with normative Judaism, right? Because the Zohar is assuming that you know the Talmud, you know the Mishnah, you know the Tanakh front, back, and sideways, and now they're adding on top of that this other layer of interpretation. If you don't have that knowledge, it can be very destabilizing. And it has been in certain times very destabilizing, which is what the rabbis were worried about. In particular, there was an episode in the 17th century when like half or 2/3 of the Jewish world thought this guy Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah. And it kind of went sideways when he converted to Islam under pressure from the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And afterwards, the rabbis were like, you know what, let's not let anyone learn the Zohar anymore. So in certain communities, there's been a ban, or in theory or in practice, it's kind of a made up ban. It's like the grandmothers tell you can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery if you have tattoos. That's not true either. So there's like this ban that you can't learn the Zohar unless you're male, married, and 40. There's not too many of us who fit that description here, I don't think. Just 2 or 3, I think. And so actually, obviously we're not holding by that this evening. But it's also not just that's outdated, but also that wasn't true in every community. Sephardi communities, other communities never had that ban. Kids were learning Zohar in kindergarten, and it wasn't seen as something that was so kind of separate. But it is potentially dangerous and destabilizing. We have a couple of people here who are in the process of converting, right? And like a good warning, which is like, this isn't indicative of typical Judaism. What we're looking at is atypical, non-normative Judaism, and that's important to know. And there's a good reason to some extent why they were worried about that. Midnight and 2 a.m., that has to do with basically astrological understandings of the significance of different times of day. There's a real focus on midnight in the middle of the night as the most spiritual time, which if you're a night owl, you might relate to. But if you're a teenager who has to get up for school at 7 a.m., probably not.
I was wondering actually, how does Zohar relate to Kabbalah? Is it the main book of Kabbalah?
Very
So
good.
I missed a bit of your introduction. So
No, I didn't say. That's a good one, Martin. So Kabbalah is a very broad word, which means mysticism broadly. It actually means reception. So it's things which are received from a teacher. There are many different types of Jewish mysticism, which we all call Kabbalah. There's kind of meditation type mysticism. There's theology type mysticism. There's magic type mysticism, and they all coexist under the same label. But that said, the Zohar is probably the most significant book in that strain of thought that we call Kabbalah. It is sometimes called the masterpiece of Kabbalah in that way, and it certainly is very influential. Whether or not you agree with it or don't agree with it, you have to deal with it because it's such a big influence.
And is that the book that that legend says Abraham is supposed to have written or something? Because there's some.
That's a different book. That's Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation.
Oh, that's one, yeah. Okay.
Which unfortunately Abraham didn't write, but it is much older. But... Yes. So the Sefer Yetzirah is the first book of Jewish mysticism. It's written in the 2nd century. It is very, very short and very brief and very obscure. The Zohar is 1,000 years later and is not brief, but is very obscure. Right. One thing I didn't mention earlier, which is the last thing I think I need to say in introduction, is it's not even written in Hebrew. It's written in a made-up language, basically. They made up a dialect of Aramaic, a dialect which didn't really exist previously, in order to teach the Zohar through this made-up dialect of Aramaic. The reason they used this made-up dialect of Aramaic is because they wanted it to seem as though it was written much older, right? They wanted it to seem as though it was as old as Sefer Yetzirah, so they imagined that it was being composed in the 2nd century Aramaic. It wasn't written in the 2nd century. It was written in Spain in the 13th century. That's quite obvious when you're reading it in Aramaic and you come across a bunch of Spanish words, and they have a very bad sense of geography in the land of Israel. But there are certainly ideas that probably are as old as it claims to be. It was very common for texts to claim to be much older than they were in the medieval period. Someone would write something and fake it as being much older than it was to make it more authentic or to make it seem more authoritative. All right, hi, Julian who's just joined us, welcome. I'm gonna pull up the text, we're gonna take a look at it. And what I would like to do is just have different people read. I'll interrupt you, we'll discuss. We've got quite a bit to try and get through. It's okay if we don't get through all of it. I'm also, before I pull it up, in case anyone doesn't want to read it on a screen, I'm gonna put a link in the chat to the same text. If you want to pull it up on your own screen or on your own computer, that should be it there. Okay. So this is the translation that we're looking at is the first English translation that's really serious. And that was only done in the last 15 years. So it tells you how recent it is that there's been exposure to learning Zohar in English. This translation is done by Professor Daniel Matt. It's called the Pritzker Zohar. It's very, very good. It's the only English translation that's any good. And it took, almost 1,000 years after the Zohar came to light for there to be a good English translation. So that tells you somewhat the obscurity of some of these texts, even though it has had a big influence. So if it's all right, I'm just going to kind of call on people to read. Hopefully you can see it in front of you. There's some strange words. Don't be put off if you see some strange words. And we're going to read, interrupt, read, interrupt. Amir, you're going to start for us.
All right. Rabbi Abba said, how many thousands, how many myriads of holy camps does the Blessed Holy One have? Masters of supernal faces, masters of eyes, masters of weapons, masters of trumpeting, masters of howling, masters of judgment, masters of compassion. Above them, he has appointed Metronita to minister before him in the palace.
Okay. Thank you, Amir. What are we talking about? What are the myriads of holy camps? All these masters of things.
I mean, it sounds like it's a great band.
Sounds like a great band. Could be. Daniel, I saw a hand. You're welcome to just take yourself off mute and chime in.
Yeah, maybe angels.
Good. Yes, angels. I think
Yeah.
that's probably right. What we call angels, right, is these camps and camps of all these beings, right? A very robust idea of all these different angels. Ones that are howling, ones that are eyes, ones that are whatever. Angels in the Torah are not the kind of, white wings, harp, and a halo sort of thing. They're horrifying, terrifying creatures.
The camps and the masters of eyes and masters of weapons sounds like an army or like a battlefield or something as well.
Good. Yes, I think that as well, which is really important, right? The angels, or what we usually call angels, these beings that exist in the kind of cosmic realm, they're primarily a military function, as we see it so far. Is this notion of them being somewhat there as soldiers, kind of a heavenly army, right? Which, by the way, that word camp is used. That's in Hebrew, it's sivaot. We use that very often. It's both the word for army and the word for kind of assortment of angels, which implies that we always thought about angels as being in somewhat an army of God, which is so uncomfortable for many of us, but very deeply medieval, right? The people that are writing this in the midst of the Spanish Inquisition. If that gives you any context to how they're thinking about what's going on around them. They're seeing armies of God very present in their own life. So we have there's a lot of poetry here. Right? It's not about taking in information. It's about getting a sense of what's being described. We have all of these many, many myriads of all these different angels, slightly military, slightly menacing component to it. And above them all, he, capital H, he, we're talking about male God, has appointed Matronita to minister before him in the palace. Okay, so Matronita is going to be the prime character that we're interested in. Matronita, in case anyone's taken Latin, means little lady. Little lady in Spanish, in medieval Spanish. It's kind of an Aramaic Spanish hybrid, this particular word. This is one of many names used for the feminine conception of God, also called the Shekhinah, most frequently called the Shekhinah, elsewhere called many other things. I think I put a note at the bottom. Let's just see the bottom of this page. Yep. So the Shekhinah, the queen, she, her, assembly of Israel, the bride, the princess, the dove, etc. Right, I mentioned before, the Zohar has a conception that God has two primary aspects, a male one and a female one, and we're seeing already that interaction, that the male God, which we often refer to as the Blessed Holy One, that's the male God, is appointed or has appointed the female God, Matronita, to supervise the heavenly army. Already we're in some strange territory if you grew up thinking Judaism was ethical monotheism, am I right? Cool. Amir, do you want to read one more paragraph for us here?
Yeah, sure. If you don't, no one else minds. Corresponding to these, Matronita has armed camps bearing 60 faces, all girded with swords, encircling her. Before her, they go forth. Before her, they come in. With 6 wings, they fly throughout the world. In front of every single one, coals of flaming fire. His garments flashing fire. On his back, blade of a sword flashing throughout the world to guard her, as is written, the flame of the whirling sword to guard the way to the tree of life.
Thank you. All right, what is this adding to our imagery? It is all imagery. So what comes to mind when you read this? What are you imagining? It's okay to imagine God. This is a safe space to imagine God. Even if you were told as a kid you're not allowed to. What are you imagining?
Is this a bit like Ezekiel's chariot or something?
Okay, so definitely some Ezekiel energy here. Kind of the fire, the imagery. I mean, quite literally, they're describing, right, a feminine being of some kind, Matronita, who is surrounded by all of these angelic soldiers, right? The ones that have 6 wings, and they all have swords on their backs, strapped to their backs. and they all have coals and flashing fire. Their garments are made out of fire. It's absolutely trippy, right? It'd be really fun to draw, but it's really hard to imagine. And that's kind of the purpose, is that it's getting us to think outside of our normal framework. Now, they give us this quote from the Torah itself at the end. What's that doing, Jackie?
It's the random bit which says there's an angel with a sword guarding the Garden of Eden, and it's totally random, and you think, where on earth has that come from? And then they're playing with it beautifully and creating something with it, because the sword, the angel with a sword, had to have come from somewhere and done something after the Garden of Eden, you know.
So good. So we have this very strange, very early on in Genesis, this very strange verse. And I have the verse here at the bottom. He drove out the human and placed east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and the flame of the whirling sword to guard the way to the tree of life. Right? Literally, we're imagining this swirling, flaming sword. And we all read that every year and go, huh, that's weird, and move on. Right? The Zohar is very interested in the moments where we go, that's weird. It wants to know what's going on behind that. And it's reading it very literally. The Zohar will often read it hyper literally. Tree of life, capitalized, is Matronita. Right? She is the tree of life. And they base that on the fact that we say that all the time. We sing the song, Eitz Chaim Hi, right? She is a tree of life. Now, when we sing that song, we mean the Torah, but they mean the Shekhinah, who is the Torah. So they're playing with all of these things, the feminine nature of the tree of life, which of course leads to them seeing the flame of the whirling sword to guard the way to the tree of life as a pretty decent, midrash on that, saying, okay, that's describing these angels who have flaming garments and swords strapped to their back, who protect Matronita, who is the tree of life.
Adam, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, man, come on. Questions are good.
So I mean, both in the Torah, but also, in any of these kind of Zohar Midrashim, is there anything to like different like colors of fire? There's a lot of fire, but there's also different types of fire.
Oh yeah.
And I feel like that kind of detail seems like it might be pertinent.
Yeah, here it's not exactly what they're on, but they spend pages and pages talking about a flame, the blue part, the white part, the yellow part, the orange part. There's a lot of focus on fire as a meditative tool. There's lots of kind of staring at a flame. And also it's used symbolically for many purposes. The burning bush, here, the flaming sword, etc.
But also like coals of flaming fire. I mean, it's a very specific type of fire.
There's a reference in that to a very deep mystical concept. Right? Often when the mystics are talking about this notion of God being male and female, one of the ways they justify it is that they use the parable of it's like a coal and a flame, right? You can't have a flame without a coal, and if you just have a coal, you don't have a flame, right? They're codependent on each other. I'm not sure I said that right, but you need to have both in order to have fire, right? You need to light the coal, and you need to have energy for the flame, and they, as a result, are dependent on each other. One thing, ultimately, but in two pieces. And that's the language that's very common and frequent in this kind of Kabbalistic notion, and probably partially the reason they use coal here as a description in particular.
That's very interesting. Sorry, one quick follow-up was just about garments as well. I mean, with all the rules around garments and what can they be made from and all that, hullabaloo, I'm surprised there's not more. I mean, I know this is commentary, but I'm surprised there's not more, I suppose, detail in the type of garment.
They don't care at all about the halacha, about if you're referencing kind of shatnez and what garments can be mixed or not mixed. They don't care at all about that, right?
I'm sorry,
yeah.
Well, just about like, what robes the Kohanim would wear, like stuff like that. Not even just the mixing of the fabrics, like, I don't know.
I mean, what we're going to see, and the reason I'm going to try and push us through is because what we'll see is actually that the Zohar is unusual in Jewish books, and that it doesn't actually matter if we get every word. Right? It doesn't matter if we look at every word and understand what it means. It's trying to convey a concept or an idea, and it's trying to do it usually through very poetic means. So don't get too hung up on any particular word, although often they all have significance. What we're trying to do is understand, what are they telling us? What is the description, the theological content? And in that sense, it's about looking at that strange verse in Genesis and giving it a new meaning by imagining the Matronita surrounded by all of these heavenly soldiers. which of course, if they exist, are indescribable. So it's just a matter of approximating it through language.
Cool.
There's something that
let's-
seems really sort of astronomical about it as well. With the in front of every single one, there's coals of flaming fire. It sounds almost like comets. Like you have the lead, the sphere at the front with a trail coming from it.
I like that idea. Yeah. I mean, it could be that you can read many of these things naturalistically, but to be fair, they don't care that it sounds like literal mythology, right? Like they're comfortable with that. So although you can look at it and go, there's a naturalistic way to read that, and I think the comet one is really good. It's not strictly necessary. We can accept it as it is, as a kind of really ridiculously extreme, mythological, probably borderline polytheistic text, because that's what it's meant to be. Right, Lee, do you want to read next for us? You volunteered by saying something.
Who is the way to the tree of life? Matronita, who is the way to that great and mighty tree, the tree of life. And it is written, behold the bed of Solomon, 60 warriors surrounding her, of the warriors of Israel. Israel above, all of them skilled with the sword. When Matronita moves, they all move behind her. As is written, the angel of Elohim moved.
Okay. So what are we adding to our image now with this additional reference, and how are they applying the Song of Songs here? Once again, taking a biblical verse, and they often do Song of Songs, and adding something from it.
Seems like choreography or like a dance or like an army's formation in movement.
Good. Yeah, I think, right, they're imagining now how these things move together in a military sense. It's not just theoretical, right? They're imagining actually, how does this work? And they imagine all of these soldiers moving behind her. And they base this on a verse in Song of Songs, which is not itself about a divine feminine being who's fighting a war, but instead is talking about Solomon's bed with 60 warriors surrounding it, warriors of Israel. You could read that in Song of Songs on a Peshat level, on a simple level, as just talking about the fact that Solomon has guards outside his bed, right? Reasonable for a king to have 60 warriors outside his bedchamber. But they're reading it as something allegorical, understanding it as a description of the warriors surrounding Matronita, who of course is understood to be representative of Israel above, right? The warriors of Israel, that's down here when it talks about Solomon, but there's a dual meaning to Israel above when we talk about the Matronita. And that's often a play that we're going to see it again in this passage, is the similarity and the symmetry between the world down here that we know and the world up there, right? They assume that things are the same, or at least that there's mirror images of things below and above and above and below, which is a typical mystical assumption. There's a correspondence between our world and the divine world.
I don't remember a lot of warriors happening in the Song of Songs.
This is the one reference to it.
Okay.
Is talking about Solomon's bed and how it's guarded. And it goes into more depth. I think I probably brought the verse down here. Yeah, there's the next verse. All of them skilled with a sword, expert in war, each with his sword on his thigh because of terror in the night. So that's the briefest description about Solomon's bedchamber and how inapproachable it is. I think from the point of view of the female speaker, who of course is trying to reach Solomon's bedchamber, because Song of Songs is about sex. If that's not obvious, it's too late now. But that's not a huge theme about the knights who guard the bed. But it certainly is an important one for them in this moment, in thinking about the angels who surround Matronita, all of them armed with a sword and flaming garments.
So they've gone through everything and thought, where are their flaming swords, and picked out the bits. Okay.
Yeah, or, I mean, we can't underestimate the facility that these guys had with the texts, right? The reality is they probably weren't working backwards, as it might seem, but they rather knew all of this stuff and had all of these pieces, and they drew connections, intertextual connections between things that we wouldn't, which is quite amazing. Now, each of this is compounding. It's moving on from one thing to another. So they quoted at the end, when Matronita moves, they all move behind her. And their proof of that is the text from Exodus 14, which is actually what's in the parashah they're commenting on, which is the angel of Elohim moved. The full verse, once again, here is at the bottom. The angel of Elohim who was going before the camp of Israel journeyed or moved and went behind them. Right, that's immediately before the Song of the Sea. It's a strange description that often most non-mystical commentators, like the other one from the Garden of Eden, they don't have a good reading of. Right? What does this mean that God's angel who was in front of the camp now moved behind the camp? How can an angel move from the front to the back? What does that mean? The rationalist approach, right, the Maimonidean approach, would just be to kind of shrug it off as an allegory or as symbolic language. But the Kabbalistic approach is to take it hyper literally and to understand that what it means is actually the angel of Elohim is actually moved from being in front of them to behind them. And so that's why they're now going to ask this question. Now, is she, the Matronita, called the angel of Elohim? Is that who we're talking about in this verse? Jackie, do you want to continue for us?
Now, is she called angel of Elohim? Rabbi Abba said, yes, come and see. Rabbi Shimon said as follows, the Blessed Holy One established before him a holy palace, a supernal palace, a holy city, a supernal city called Jerusalem, the holy city. Whoever enters the presence of the king enters only through this holy city, following the way to the king. For from here, the way is paved, as it is written, this is the gate to Yotevavhe, the righteous shall enter through it.
Right. What's happening here? What do we recognize? What are they playing with? There's a couple levels happening at the same time.
I mean, if Jerusalem is also the matronita or feminine, and you've got to get to God through the matronita and has to enter her presence, it just sounds ever so sexual.
Good, it's supposed to, absolutely. Right, don't let Freud get in the way. It's obviously sexual in many ways. There's a kind of penetrative image here, no doubt about it. So yes, right, there's the Blessed Holy One established a holy palace, right? That's down here below, and a supernal palace. Supernal means in a world above, right? A holy city, that's Jerusalem down below, and a supernal city, the Jerusalem up above. Now, the proof of this is in the word Jerusalem, right? Is anyone familiar with what's happening in the word Yerushalayim? David, tell us. You're on mute. Either David.
Oh, okay.
No, please. Dude, what? No, either one.
Went back on mute.
Yeah, no, I defer.
It's not a trick question, right? Yerushalayim is a dual word, right? In Hebrew, there's three cases of number: singular, plural, and dual, meaning two. And we use this for body parts: einayim, two eyes; oznaim, two ears. There's a dual case. Yerushalayim is in the dual case, which begs the question: why are there two Jerusalems? What are the two Jerusalems? Which is why there's always been this tradition that there's a Jerusalem below and the Jerusalem above. So they have plenty of ground to theoretically stand on above when they suggest that just as there's a mirror image of Jerusalem, we can understand that Shekhinah is like Jerusalem in that way. And the way that she's like Jerusalem is that if you want to come see the king, you go to Jerusalem because it's the capital city, and there's only one way to go in because there's only one road that's paved, and that is the way, right? And literally it's called in Hebrew Derech HaMelech, the king's road. That's how it was in the ancient world. There was one road that led to the palace. Right? All roads lead to Rome, but only one road leads to the palace. And they're drawing an analogy between that and the notion of matronita as the one way to approach divinity through
Can I just quickly ask? Presumably, the palace means the temple. Is that right? I mean, it might be obvious, but I just thought, or is it not?
Yes and no, probably. I think it means the place where divinity is, which in many cases is understood to be the temple. But actually, it's all about the analogy, right? It's not about any particular identification. It's about the analogy that if you come to approach a king, and this isn't so different today. I mean, lahavdil to today. But if you wanted to seek an audience with the prime minister, right, or the queen, which we have one of those. There's only one way to go, right? You have to go to this palace in this way. You can't just come any way you want to approach the queen. You have to go a certain way. And that would have always been the case, especially more the case in ancient times with royalty. There's only one way to get to the palace, only one way to get to the king. And that's the analogy that they're drawing, is that matronita, the feminine, the Shekhinah, is the way of approaching divinity. You can't just walk up to the male deity. You have to go through the female deity. And that's what they're reading with that last verse, which is, of course, from Hallel, which will be familiar to us. Zeh hasha'ar ladonai. This is the gate to God. The righteous shall enter through it. Right? So it's through the Shekhinah that we approach divinity. It's through femininity that we approach divinity. That's the part that's accessible to us. Does that feel like a radical idea to anyone? No? Rotem's going, no. You're all about that. I mean, it is.
Oh.
Is it not a thing that like we are closest to God during sex? Is it? I mean,
Well, I think it is a thing that most people would testify to, but it's not something we generally talk about in Jewish spaces, is it?
no, but I mean, Ashchina yoredet when we
Yep.
are in the act. So I think it makes sense to me that it is the gate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it made sense to the medieval mystics who were behind this as well. One of the things that we notice when we look at this stuff is actually how much things have been suppressed from Judaism in the quest to be modern and enlightened and reasonable and sensible and to be like our well-educated non-Jewish neighbors. We kind of threw out a lot of the superstitious, mythological, naturalistic, mythological stuff like this. And that's a shame because there's something that is very inherent about it. So yes, I think it is quite natural to understand that it's through this notion of God as a feminine entity, which is how we begin to approach divinity. But it's not something we generally would articulate, and something that many people would think is actually quite at odds with how they conceive Judaism.
Are there any other examples of words in Judaism, like places in Judaism that also have doubled letters, like Yerushalayim?
Yeah. So there's a place that they go to in the desert called Machanaim, which means two camps.
In modern Hebrew, there's Givatayim.
Yep, yeah, that's right.
Two
hills.
Two hills.
Yeah.
Sha'arayim, just outside of Rehovot.
There you go.
2 gates.
Keep going,
It's a common theme and it's all that they're all these similar ideas as to a pair of places, like you've said, hills, mountains, gates. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And what the thing is, in those cases, like Givatayim, it makes sense, right? Because maybe there's 2 big hills there. I haven't been there, so that's why they get the name. Yerushalayim's name, in that sense, is less obvious. Why is there 2 of them? And so it begs the question in a more profound way. And because Yerushalayim is, of course, such a profound symbol of the feminine idea of God, right? Think about Lamentations, the book Eicha, we read on Tisha B'Av. We talk about the city as a woman crying, mourning, weeping, which is very common in the ancient Near East, to imagine a city as a woman. And all they're doing is just doubling down on that, right? They're not actually doing anything radical. They're just focusing on things in our tradition that we generally don't pay much attention to. All right, let's read on a bit more. Who wants to read next? How about Lorene? If you don't want to, by the way, you don't have to. I'm just calling on people randomly. You're on mute at the moment, Lorene.
So we're going from every mission, is that where we are?
Yep.
Every mission that the king wishes issues from the house of Matronita. Every mission from below to the king enters the house of Matronita first, and from there to the king. Consequently, Matronita is agent of all, from above to below and from below to above. And for she is the opening to the king, way to the king, and no secret is concealed from her. From above to below, or from below to above. Thus she is agent of all, as is written, the angel of Elohim, as it is written, and Yahweh was going before them by day, as we have established.
Okay. What's happening here? They're as usual, they're kind of restating things in different terms, right? We already talked about how they're establishing the idea that Matronita is the gateway and the way in which we approach divinity only through her. One of the things that we kind of have a tension about is the question of power. right? It seems like the king is more powerful and thus more reclusive, and she is less powerful and thus more accessible. Yes? But what is this suggesting actually is the inverse?
There is no way to get to the king unless you go through her.
Yes. Which, does that give her more power or less?
Oh.
I think it's actually quite a powerful position, and that's one of the reasons they restate it, right? She is the opening to the king, way to the king, from abode to below, nothing secret from her. Although she is in a less privileged position in the conception they have, because she's more accessible, because she's lower, the reality is because she's the only way to go, she has a tremendous amount of power. She's literally the gatekeeper, right? This notion of the feminine, the feminine divinity as being the gatekeeper means that from our point of view, it's the only one that matters. Right? The masculine divinity is absent.
But isn't it also implying that she's the angel of God as well as being the female aspect of God?
Yeah, they have no problem calling any number of names the same thing. Absolutely, right? So they're saying in particular. So it's the phrase "angel of Elohim," which is used very infrequently in the Torah. Often it's Malach Adonai, right? Angel of God with Yud Hey Vav Hey. Very rarely is it Malach Elohim, which is why they're focusing on that, as maybe that's another description of her. And in particular, that's the proof text, because in the story of the Red Sea, or not the Red Sea, but the sea that they're splitting, which is probably a lake, it's talking about Malach Elohim. So they have to connect it to that. They have to connect it to this notion that she's also referred to as Malach Elohim, which makes sense because what is a Malach? We use the word angel, which is a nonsense word. And we have to stop using it because we imagine people with harps and white halos. What is Malach actually?
Is it something to do with messenger?
That's right. Yes, it's a messenger. It's someone who carries a message, a sentry, an agent. Yeah, Daniel.
Actually, this is the meaning of the word in Old Greek, angelos, which is also messenger.
Right.
And the reason for which they are represented with wings is actually that in order to suggest, like in the Christian church, it's actually to suggest that they can move very quickly from one place to another. And actually that the space, I mean, as we perceive it, the physical space is not a problem for them. So this is why they are represented with wings. So yeah.
Makes sense, right? They start out with a symbol to show an idea, and people ultimately just get stuck on the symbol. And then you have, our contemporary angel Halloween costumes with a white robe and big fancy white wings and a halo. So, yeah, sorry.
Sorry for interrupting. What I found very interesting, I found out something recently, is that in Judaism, people are not allowed to pray to angels because angels have a very specific mission which is to deliver messages. While in the Christian church, people are allowed to pray to angels, and actually angels are seen like not like worshiping an idol or worshiping the creation of God, but actually like having, the angel delivering your prayer and your request to God. So you ask the angel to deliver your message to God, which actually is his mission. This is why the angel was created.
Really, really interesting and really kind of important moment of what's happening here as well, because what that whole discussion is about is intermediaries, right? Is there an intermediary between you and God? And Christianity, by and large, is very comfortable with the idea of intermediaries. In some ways, that's what the first notion is of Jesus, as an intermediary, right? A facilitator of the relationship. And as a result of that, Judaism tends to distance itself quite dramatically from the idea of an intermediary. And yet what we see here is that we are supporting the idea there's intermediary, but the intermediary is God itself divided into one aspect. So it's the feminine side of God, which is the intermediary with the rest of it, which is kind of a halfway moment that reflects a different view than is typical. David, I see your little digital hand.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we look at the Hebrew word malach, it's you can split it up to melech and the aleph inside it, and the aleph stands for God, obviously, echad, the one, and he is part of that king, who the Melech, who is the representative of God. He's the leader, and if you've got that leader, that important person who God has appointed in order to give his message, and that's why he's within him. And you can also see there the two-sidedness of the whole issue, of Melech and Hashem, and the ALEF Elokim.
It's really interesting little drosh on that word, because it's not a word that we can easily connect to other words in Hebrew as well. Its shoresh is not immediately clear, so it makes sense to connect it to Melech, perhaps. That's an interesting idea. Okay, yes, Daniel, sorry.
You said earlier that Judaism distances itself from this idea of intermediaries, but there is this habit of people going to the tombs of tzaddikim. So is this to having them as intermediaries? Because
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So like anything, right? There's what the official line is, and there's what people do, and often they're not the same thing. And the practice of going to the graves of people and praying there, which is using the souls of those who have died as an intermediary, is one that does derive almost exclusively from Kabbalah. Because once you introduce this idea that actually there's this whole cosmic order in which there's things in between you and God, in which there's a way to access God, then it's not a big jump to say, well, maybe I can also use my ancestor, and maybe I can also do this. So yes, it kind of slides into all sorts of things that officially Judaism would maybe say it's not comfortable with, but it also exposes to us something that's really important, which is there's no such thing as Judaism. Right? There's not one version of Judaism by any means. There tends to be two major approaches, which are the mystical and the rational, and they have very different assumptions. And we can see that developing even in this text. Amir.
Yeah, just real quickly off of what Daniel's just said, the Kotel, the Western Wall, in the same respect, like, because that is an intermediary, it's almost like emails to God, like, but how does that fit in with what you've just said? Because I don't think it should.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. A rigorous rationalistic theology of Judaism, in which there's no intermediary, would have no time at all for the Kotel as a wall, nor the idea of putting notes into the wall. Right? One of probably the most hardcore rationalists was a rabbi named Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who was like a hardcore Maimonidean in the last century, and he famously called the Kotel the discotel as the way to insult it. Right? It's like a discotheque in Hebrew, and he hated it. He talked all the time about how horrible the discotel was, which is a very unusual thing to hear Israelis talk about, because the truth is there's something very natural about looking for an intermediary, right? It is the natural position to be in, to go, God is this huge transcendent thing who I can't see, can't touch, can't feel, can't hear. Let me find something that I can touch, feel, hear, see, and use that as a way to go in between. That makes sense, right? It's a natural human impulse. Maybe that's nature. Maybe that's a conception of femininity in the sense we see here. Maybe it's a wall. But they're all shades of the same impulse. And whether they're acceptable or not is really kind of an irrelevant question, because Jews are going to do whatever they're going to do. And then it's explained after the fact. So yes, personally, I'm quite skeptical about the Kotel. I find it a bit strange. See everyone there.
I was just wondering, surely the thing about the Kotel is it's not, obviously it isn't even part of the temple. It's like the retaining wall, outer wall.
Yeah.
But surely the point of the Kotel is it's like as near the nearest we can get to the temple.
That's
isn't that
right.
the point of it? It's not. I didn't even think it was an intermediary. I just thought it's as close as we can get, sort of thing.
That's absolutely right. It is the closest we can get. But people in that moment feel like, oh, this is also closer to God. Right? Not just closer to an archaeological remnant of a holy place, but actually this is the closest point to God, which is why they start putting notes in the wall, thinking that God is going to read them, which is a very sensible, natural thing to do, which I'm not suggesting you shouldn't, but actually doesn't make much sense if you think about it. Because the notion of God that we typically have is that God isn't in one place, and certainly not in that place per se. But all of that is introduced by the comfortability of mysticism, with the notion that maybe there is more shades to God and people than we think, right? Maybe it's not just people down here, God up there, and no touching. Maybe there's actually more shades and degrees to it. And the Shekhinah is one element of that. She's the accessible part, even if the normal conception of God as a masculine being is not. Right, let's say a little bit on, because they're going to object to themselves and try and challenge their own idea. And I think it's quite interesting to see the gender piece as well that's happening here. David, do you want to read for us? David Rabin?
Now, is it an honor for the king that Matronita should go and wage wars and act as an agent? Well, this may be compared to a king who coupled with a lofty noble lady. The king saw how her glory surpassed all the other noble ladies of the world. He said, "They are all concubines compared to my lady. She surpasses them all. What shall I do for her? Well, look, my entire household will be in her hands." The king issued a proclamation. "Henceforth, all affairs of the kind are entrusted to the Matronita." What did he do? What did he do?
Yeah, go on.
The king placed in her control all his weapons, all the warriors, all those royal jewels, all the royal treasures. He said, "From now on, anyone who needs me cannot speak with me until he notifies the Matronita."
All right, that's the first half of the parable. Let's just read the second half, which is when they connect it to their notion here, and then we'll...
Similarly, the Blessed Holy One, out of his great love for the Assembly of Israel, entrusted everything to her. He said, "Look, all the other are nothing compared to her." He said, 60 queens are they and 80 concubines. One she is, my dove, my perfect one. One she is to her mother, from Shir Shirim. What shall I do for her? Well, look, my entire household will be in her hands. He issued a proclamation. Henceforth, all affairs of the king are entrusted to Matronita. He placed in her control of all his weapons, lances, swords, bows, arrows, catapults, fortresses, stones, all those warriors, as it is written, the bed of Solomon, 60 warriors surrounding her, all of them skilled with a sword.
Thank you. So we have this parable as a way of explaining. Now, the question that's raised at the very beginning, which David read with appropriate drama, is scandal, right? Is it appropriate? Is it right for the king to entrust everything to a woman? Right, that's the subtext here. And the answer is, well, of course it is, because look at this parable about how a king met this wonderful noble lady that he thought was so great. He just gave everything to her. She was now responsible for everything, the whole household. She was going to manage who comes in, who goes out. She was going to be in charge of the army. She was going to be in charge of the treasury. And just as that is the case, so they imagine that that's the same relationship between the king and the queen, right, in terms of us discussing God. That the king was so impressed with the queen that he just gave everything to her. In particular, it's about the military, right? This is partially one of the things that's interesting about this is that we're talking about femininity, but it's not the typical Western conception of what femininity is, right? Part of femininity is fighting in this conception, which, by the way, is due more to our ancestry in the ancient Near East, and the fact that in the ancient Near East, the goddesses were goddesses of love and war at the same time, which also influenced Greece to a little bit. And that's the mode in which they're operating, is that the Shekhinah is basically functioning like those goddesses did, as both the personification of femininity as an attractive depiction of love, but also as a scary, frightening depiction of war, which is why she's the one in charge of all the armies, the lances, the swords, the bows, the arrows, the catapults, the fortresses, the stones, and all the warriors.
Hannah would like me to say that once again, women have to do everything for everybody.
Be everything for everyone. Be beautiful. Be strong. Look after the house. This tale as old as time, my friends.
I'm just thinking, what's God doing?
Just chilling, I guess. Absolutely great question. What is God doing? What is God now, the king, right? Let's use the words the king and the queen. What is he up to? What is he doing? He's becoming very unsympathetic to us.
Not a lot.
Yeah.
He's in the parlor house counting out his money.
Yeah.
Also, if you have the power to give so much power to someone else, you are way more powerful, and it's very obvious.
Yes.
Here.
Yes, absolutely. Really good, Rotem, right? It's easy for us to look at this and go, oh, this is so nice. It's such an interesting application of femininity. And some people, when they first look at the Zohar, go, oh, look, it's feminist. It's not feminist, right? Because it's still reaffirming the idea that she only has power because he gave it to her, because he liked her so much. So it's not that she has any inherent power of her own, which would be much more appealing to us as modern feminists. It's not that at all. But despite that, it is a lot closer in some way to some notion of equality, because there are two beings here, both of whom end up, for all intents and purposes, with real power, and relative to us, only one of whom ends up being at all relevant, which is the Shekhinah, which is the queen. The king is irrelevant to us, right? And we talked about Freud earlier, but it's not a big jump to look at this in the context of the kind of absent father, right, and the kind of present mother. That's the notion that we have our relationship with God, is that God is two parts, one of which is the mother, which is accessible to us, who comforts us and fights for us, and the father who's just kind of off somewhere in the distance, who we can't reach. Something very interesting about that, both as a version of the ancient Near Eastern myths about gods and goddesses, a similar pattern is seen there, but also as a very real psychological phenomenon about families and about how we relate to God as a parent. Right? It's a much more appealing notion for many to see God as a mother than as a father, because the mother is much more involved in the child's life, at least especially in the medieval conception. What else is this playing on? Keep in mind that the people putting this together are very influenced probably by the Christianity they see around them in Catholic Spain in the midst of the Inquisition.
Say it again.
Mary.
Mary, who said Mary?
Hannah's off screen, she said it.
Oh, good, Mary. Janice, is that what you were going to say?
I've got another idea, and it's a bit of a tangent. Is it just saying that there's one God because she's got all these concubines and you mustn't believe in all these different people, and then we should come back to one central God? Or is that completely way out?
Well,
it's a big step from where we are.
No, not necessarily, right? The proof text they use is proof text from Song of Songs, and right, the best preparation for studying Jewish mysticism is really reading Song of Songs a lot, because what they see in Song of Songs is a love story between the king and the queen, right? A metaphorical love story between the king and the queen, the male and the female aspects of God. So what they're is partially the case, Janice, because what they're identifying is saying there's only one feminine aspect, there's only one aspect, but it's still working within the assumption that there's a king and a queen, even though we do understand those as being both aspects, sides of God, right? Like two-headed Janus. Nonetheless, they see it as being partially the possibility there could be more. So, I mean, they're not too bothered about what we call monotheism, because they assume that everyone believes there's only one God. What they're playing with is how we encounter that God and how we manifest that God and how that God manifests to us. Yeah, Daniel.
I was thinking, maybe I'm a bit far from what the text is trying to say, but maybe this fragment speaks about the relationship between Gvura and Hesed. The masculine and the feminine, you have the judgment, but on the other side you have the feminine attribute, which is like, kindness and,
It's the reverse.
Okay.
Yeah, so very, very good observation. Yeah, so we're not going to go into the Sphirot because it's a little bit too complicated, but they absolutely have multiple versions of this male-female binary, and they're not always what we'd expect. And one of those is the relationship between Chesed and Gevurah. Chesed is the masculine, and it's all about love and passivity and kind of kindness. And Gevurah is the feminine, which is all about power and restriction and control, which is a very interesting kind of mode in its own self, but also leads us to seeing this here, right, where we see the feminine as the warrior, right? What we're talking about is that we encounter God as a warrior queen. That's not usually what you hear in Cheder, in case that's not obvious. Right, that we should encounter God as a warrior queen. Now, Hannah in the background over there said a moment ago about Mary, right? At the same time that this is happening in Judaism, that we're having this explosion of interest in talking about God as a feminine being, at the same time in Christianity, there's a huge explosion of Marianic Christianity, thinking about Mary as a being who's in a relationship with God and has Mary as an intermediary, right? That if you want to reach God, you go through Mary. So there's a lot of the same thing happening here. Whether that's because both medieval Spanish Christianity and medieval Spanish Judaism both got it from somewhere else, or whether they got it from each other, doesn't matter, don't care, right? The idea is that it's an archetype that we're seeing in both at the same time. And then interestingly, never shows up in Islam, but shows up prominently in Christianity and less prominently here in Judaism. The idea there's a feminine portal to divinity.
The way I sort of see Shekhinah is having the quality of that the whole idea of Earth is central to her, because she's the one connected to Earth where we are, and we need the Earth to be grounded, and we need to be grounded to be able to have a relationship higher up. Otherwise, we'd kind of fizzle off into nothing.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of Earth quality that seems really important to me.
It's absolutely the case that it's one of the many binaries that are like all of these are playing on binaries, and you can map them all onto each other. And one of those is material versus kind of spiritual. And it is absolutely the case that they see the feminine, the Shekhinah, as being related to the material world, right? To real physical reality, which of course means the earth, which is not a big jump to our conception of Mother Earth as we might talk about today, although that has a slightly different kind of connotation in many senses. But it's a piece of who the Shekhinah is, because that's one of the binaries that's mapped onto her. One of the other ones is sun and moon, right? That the king is the sun and the Shekhinah is the moon. Another great example of the power, right? The moon shines, but the moon only shines because it's reflecting the sun's light. So it's a great example of how they understand femininity, that there is power there, but it's power derived from masculinity, which of course reinforces the patriarchal structure that's underpinning it. So we see all of these pieces kind of at the same time, right? Because mysticism is happy to see correspondences between things that we otherwise wouldn't. So yes, I don't think that's a big jump at all. Let's do a little bit more. There's a little bit more here that I brought with us. We don't need to do it all, actually. But just wanted to do these last two verses, which kind of wrap up section, these last two paragraphs. Someone happy to read those for us? Any volunteers? Dr. Conowan. Julian? You're on mute.
The kings got me?
Yep.
Okay. The king said, "From now on, my battles are in your hand. My weapons are handed over to you along with the warriors. From now on, you will guard me, as it is written, Garden of Israel. From now on, anyone who needs me cannot speak with me until he notifies Matronita, as it is written, Bezot. With this shall Aaron enter the holy zone, agent of all as we have established. Consequently, all is in honor of Matronita." Do you want me to read the rest of it?
Yeah, do the next one as well, yeah.
Can you scroll down a little?
Oh, sorry.
The angel of Elohim who was going before the camp of Israel moved, as has been said, and went behind them. Why behind them? So that in front of her would appear warriors, catapultiers, lancemen, swordsmen, revealed in front of her, since other camps were coming to wage war against Israel from above.
Right, thank you. So this kind of wraps up a few things, and I think makes for a nice unit here. One is that they're playing with this idea and looking for proofs of this idea that Matronita is the point of access. And they get one of them from Leviticus, a very unlikely place, a verse which starts bezot, with this, and unusually it uses the feminine form of this, which is zot. So they see the feminine form of zot instead of zeh there as indication that what it's actually secretly talking about is Shekhinah, right? With this, Aaron shall enter the holy zone, meaning with the Shekhinah, Aaron shall enter the holy zone, which is a very interesting proof text because it's not at all what it's about, but they're reading it once again hyper literally, which tends to be their style. And then we return to the verse that all of this has been meant to interpret, which is the angel of Elohim who was going before the camp of Israel moved, and it moved behind them. And the question is why? And now we see it all come together. Why did the angel of Elohim, which is Shekhinah, move behind the Israelites as they're standing on the bank of the sea, so that all of her armies, her divine armies, all of her soldiers could assemble around them to protect them because they were about to wage war against the forces from above? It's absolutely a wild image, right? When we imagine the splitting of the sea, we don't tend to imagine this kind of warrior queen surrounded by heavenly armies fighting on behalf of the Israelites. But in the Zohar's imagination, there's a demonic army, which Pharaoh represents on the ground, and these kind of demon beings represent up in heaven, fighting the good army, which is the Israelites on the ground, and Shekhinah and her warriors in heaven. And these two battles are happening simultaneously, the material physical battle and the spiritual cosmic battle at the exact same time. It lends this degree of intensity to the story that we don't normally read it, which I love. I just love it. Amir.
Wow. So two questions based off that. One is, so does she not get to choose the battles? She just has to fight whatever he fights that he picks, but she can't pick her own fights. And then the second question is, you know, the Yetzer Hara or any other, like you've just said, examples of, I suppose, not evil inclinations, but demons. I guess I'm thinking of the sacrifice story, but I'm sure there's a couple others maybe. Does that mean that in this train of thought that there's a much larger battle as well being represented then?
Yes, this train of thought seems to be a much more time, right? The mystical approach has much more time for forces of evil as real forces, not to the same extent as in Christian circles and seeing the devil as being a real being that has agency, but it does have a pretty robust notion of demons, which once again was very, very frequent in early Judaism, right? In the period of the Talmud, they were obsessed with demons. A lot of what we do halachically is about demons. The reason we break the glass at the wedding, partially about demons, partially about sex. Very few rabbis at the chuppah are going to describe it that way. The reason that we blow the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, scaring away demons, right? And all of those things are kind of lost because we get uncomfortable with them. The Zohar has no interest in us being uncomfortable. It wants to go back, pull all of that stuff out of the mythological past, the gods and goddesses, the demons, the magic, and bring it back into the present, for them, the medieval period. And in some ways, that's also the position we're in today, because we've spent the last couple hundred years since the Enlightenment stuffing all this stuff into obscurity, pretending we weren't superstitious, pretending we're all good modern people who are interested in capitalism and ethical monotheism. And actually, it's only in the last 50 years probably that there's really been a conversation about maybe that's not true. And you see the explosion of neo-paganism in the world, especially in Europe. You see the explosion of different spiritualities in the New Age movement. And actually, in some way, this is the time that's very similar as well to look back at this and go, hang on, what do we do with all this stuff? Because although it's wacky, it does explain a lot of the things in the Torah that we might find strange or difficult and that otherwise we have to gloss over. It gives a different meaning to what's happening in the Torah. Right? One thing that we never dwell on in the story of the Exodus is the fact that the Israelites are described as an army. Right? They're described as an Erev Rav, which is a description of mercenaries. They're described as having swords and armor. They're described as taking the plunder from Egypt with them. They're described actually, although it's not obvious, it's kind of embedded in different places, as an army fleeing, retreating from a battle. And then they get caught in their retreat at this moment, stuck with the sea to their back. And that is in the Torah itself. We just kind of brush it away. And the Zohar, as usual, doesn't care what we want to brush away and doubles down on that image to say, yes, it was a battle. It was a battle between the holy queen of warriors who was defending us and the evil forces on the other side. Which is something I think is probably quite challenging to us. There's a little bit more here. I'm not going to dwell on it now, but just to say what it does, it connects to that in connecting it to Egypt. It talks about this verse that says that Pharaoh took 600 select chariots and all the chariots of Egypt, and goes, why does it say both 600 chariots and the chariots of Egypt? And the explanation they give is that, well, Samael, who is the closest thing to Satan or devil in this conception, which is a bad angel, he lent Pharaoh some chariots to fight the Israelites. So Pharaoh kind of was renting out chariots from demonic forces. And as a result, that's why the Shekhinah was fighting against him. And the best piece, and I think the best piece is really this last piece, in which they ask, well, how did the Blessed Holy One requite Samael for this, for lending chariots to Pharaoh? And they say, oh, well, it happened much later, literally, right, 400, 500 years later, at the Battle of Sisera, which is what's described in the Haftarah, the battle that Deborah fights against the Canaanite general Sisera, when all those chariots are described as being swept away in a river. And that's understood as being vengeance on behalf of the Shekhinah for what happened in Egypt when Pharaoh summoned the demonic powers to fight against her. And by the way, what's the main plot device of the story of the book of Deborah, or the book of Judges in the story of Deborah? What's the main plot device? Deborah warns Barak something, says, I'll fight with you, but, David?
Uses a tent peg. I don't know.
No, it's I'll fight. Yes, the tent peg, which is wonderfully graphic. I'll fight with you, but God is going to deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman.
Yes.
Yes? Which happens through Yael, who puts a tent peg through his skull. Excellent work, Yael. And that story, right, is understood here as having divine significance as well, right? That the vengeance of Yael is also the vengeance of the Shekhinah, and that this human feminine is representing the divine feminine all at the same time, which I think is just a wonderful connection for them to draw, both the Torah portion and the Haftarah. Any thoughts on this? We have a few minutes before we need to wrap up. And for anybody who's never seen this sort of stuff before, might be a little bit confused. I'm curious what your thinking is about whether this is useful or interesting to actually a Jewish spiritual life. Jackie?
I was just thinking that the masculine side of God doesn't do a lot God's self, in that I was thinking about when we were even talking about, you know, God's hitman at Pesach, you know, and it's like God needs messengers to do things. God needs the matronita. God needs this, whereas our image of God has always been singular and does everything.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Amir, we've got 1 minute, and then book group's going to take over our Zoom in a second, so we don't want to go on too
Well,
long.
if anyone else wants to say anything, I won't. I know I've spoken a lot.
Well, let me wrap it up because we're about to get logged out forcibly. Which is that I really like this. I think I like it because it's. Now I'm not thinking it's true, right? I'm not now going to walk around imagining Shekhinah as a warrior with all these soldiers. I think it's true in the way that it challenges our conceptions of what we think of Judaism, which is good, right? We should challenge our conceptions. And there's no better place to do that than looking at these sources, which are drawing on real Jewish traditions, but doing so in a way that's often very different from what we see elsewhere. And so I guess the main takeaway is no matter how you feel about Kabbalah or Judaism, I think the Zohar is a very interesting place to have some of these discussions around theology that we often don't. We just don't bother to do in Judaism. And hopefully it provokes us through its imagery and through its poetry to think a little bit differently about God and ourselves. And if it's done that at all, even in a small bit for us this evening, then I'm very glad for it. We'll be doing this quite frequently. There'll be quite a few of these, and we'll look at a different passage every time. So do come back and join us. And thank you very much for being with us here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody.
Thanks. It's fascinating.
I'm so glad. Lovely to see you all. For those staying
Bye.
on book group, enjoy.
Do we
And
stay here, or do we have to log out and log in again?
you'll find out shortly. I don't know.
Okay.